Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Craig Shelley, and I'm the Strategic Business Leader for Theranostics at GE Healthcare. Very happy to be here chairing this session this afternoon, which promises to be a very timely and forward-looking discussion on the next generation of technologies that will be accelerating the translation of novel radiopharmaceuticals from the lab to the clinic. We'll be highlighting cutting-edge innovations, including artificial intelligence, predictive modeling, advanced imaging platforms, and automation technologies that will reshape preclinical research, clinical trials, and reliable isotope production. The discussion will examine how these emerging tools overcome translational barriers, optimize workflows, and enable faster, safer, and more efficient delivery of theranostics treatments. Together, these advancements are helping to shorten the path from scientific discovery to patient access, while setting the stage for technologies of the future. Before we begin, I'll ask our panel to introduce themselves. Dr. Liu?
Great, so thank you so much, Craig. My name is Dr. Fei-Fei Liu. I'm a radiation oncologist and a scientist at the Princess Margaret at the University of Toronto. And I think the reason I've been invited to this panel is not because of that, but I do have another role at the federal level. I'm the scientific director of the Institute of Cancer Research at CIHR, which is the major federal funder of all aspects of biomedical research. And I do feel very much as an imposter on this panel.
Good afternoon. I am Chantal Hearst, Senior Manager of Technical Services at Sage Engineering. We are a consulting engineering firm. We do support our clients in the pharmaceutical and radiopharmaceutical industries, largely with commercial manufacturing type problems. We have been working in radiopharmaceuticals manufacturing for about a decade now, so very close to the infancy of the industry. And that, I think, is why I'm on this panel.
Good afternoon, everybody. You talk about imposters. So my name is Darryl Spector. I run a company called Promation. We design and build automation, robotics, and machinery. We started off in automotive around 30 years ago and then moved into power generation reactors, and then moved into radiopharmaceutical. And the analogy I use is kind of like, automotive automation production meets power gen nuclearized. They have a baby and a bit of GMP, then you get radiopharmaceutical. So on the imposter side, we got two doctors on stage. My dad was a doctor, as close as I get, but I think you're in good company, so.
Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Jerzak. I'm a breast medical oncologist at Sunnybrook Odette Cancer Center, which is affiliated with the University of Toronto. So I'm involved in a clinical trial design and involved in a number of international and national clinical trial organizations. And I also have experience with running a couple of radioligand trials that are now moving into the breast cancer space at Sunnybrook. So thank you for inviting me to participate.
Fantastic. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for your participation. So we'll get started with the question of which emerging technologies, artificial intelligence, predictive modeling, advanced imaging, are already demonstrating real impact in accelerating radiopharmaceutical translation. And part B to that, which might be overhyped at the moment. And Chantal, maybe we'll start with you.
So we can't really talk about impactful technologies without talking about automation kind of on the whole. As the industry is growing, we're seeing a very quick increase in automation in radiopharma manufacturing. We're talking about things like automated synthesis and dispensing hot cells, like robotics applications inside of hot cells, electronic data acquisition and monitoring. All of those things are consistently growing and being applied more as the industry grows and throughput grows. These are going to reduce variability, increase reliability, and reproducibility. So all very important aspects of the industry going forward. Now, we can't talk about emerging technologies in 2026 without touching on artificial intelligence. It's the thing that everybody wants to talk about and hear about and try to apply. So we are seeing very promising applications in things like image interpretation. AI is much more dynamic than traditional machine vision. It's able to better recognize patterns. This is applicable in the diagnostic space, but also on the line level in manufacturing. This is very promising to reduce really false rejects. And in areas like radiopharma, where it is so expensive to manufacture each dose, and it's also expensive to dispose of reduced doses, this could play a huge role in reducing issues like that we see on the manufacturing floor.
Yeah, maybe I'll just pick up on that one as well. You know, I'm a big fan of, because we are multi-industry with multi-pedigree, and I'm going a bit off script, so apologize, but you know, innovation isn't always inventing new things, right? Innovation is sometimes bringing proven technologies in one area to a new area. So I think that's also, you know, while it may be new to radiopharma, it might be proven in other areas like automotive automation, and then you bring in the compliance piece to it. And that's where I think, you know, we get excited because we see a lot of this kind of like first exposure type awareness to like, oh, you can do that with a robot now? You can put that in a hot cell and so on. And that's kind of where we come in because, you know, companies like Promation and Sage and so on can identify these novel applications in radiopharmaceuticals because now the scale justifies it. But it's been going on and like, you know, is this proven technology? Well, yeah, it's been around for like 40 years being used effectively. So it's reliable. Just that nuance of application in the space is kind of that variant to it that makes it more relevant today.
Particularly on that note, obviously radiopharma is very closely tied to traditional pharma, and in general, volumes in traditional pharma far outweigh radiopharma. Certainly at this stage, you can put an oral solid dose tablet into a bottle much, much quicker than you can produce a dose of radiopharmaceutical product. So again, on that note, it's going to be important going forward to look to traditional pharma, which is already in a regulated space, already has precedent set, and see how we can take those processes and that technology and translate it into the slightly differently regulated environment of radiopharma.
Are there any technologies that are overhyped or really not going to live to the potential that might be?
Yeah, so I struggle with this question a little bit because I think it's really easy to call artificial intelligence overhyped. It's the buzzword of the day. Everybody's talking about it. Everybody's using ChatGPT or Copilot or whatever your tool of choice is in their daily lives. I don't want to call it overhype because it is going to fundamentally change the way we do most things, not even just radiopharmaceutical manufacturing. But we do need to be very intentional and cautious about how we implement that in this highly regulated environment. There are some guidances that are starting to be available, and I think maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later, but we do need to make sure that we're using it in the correct way because the stakes are high. We're talking about human health, not just, you know, writing up an email or something to send to someone.
Very fair, and I think you can use that characteristic for AI in all applications. It's going to be a very, very powerful tool that will be necessary as part of many aspects of healthcare and global life, but it needs to be used appropriately and cautiously, and the data that feeding it needs to be accurate as well too. So lots to consider. Next question, Dr. Liu. What are, in your opinion, the biggest bottlenecks in moving radiopharmaceuticals from preclinical discovery to clinical use, and how are new technologies helping to remove them?
So that's great. Thank you for that question, Craig. And so I think we've heard from our other two panelists on some of the modernization of the technologies. And again, the audience knows better than I in terms of all the bottlenecks that we know about, in terms of the manufacturing and the dissemination. We've heard about the issues in terms of equity, and from Canada as a large country with a vast geography and accessibility, and in remote rural areas, underserved populations are a major problem, and also sort of designing the platforms that will be able to really facilitate the translation from preclinical to clinical. So all of these bottlenecks that we've talked about is actually not unique to this theranostic field. It is actually, unfortunately, common to Canada. And I do, again, putting on my hat as a kind of a member of the federal government, this is an issue that the government is fully aware of and is undertaking actions that will try to facilitate the translation of innovation to clinical application. And so in terms of the technologies, I think we've heard in terms of the robotic platforms, in terms of assembly and learning from other industries, we have a recent paper that was describing robotic platforms for the generation of liquid nanoparticles. And so I'm sure that type of tool could be utilized in the theranostic space, and AI, Chantal has already talked about. It is definitely very promising. It's already being utilized in the design of novel drugs, and so what in part of my job here, what I like to imagine is what the future may look like is in terms of personalized theranostics for individual patients, and also looking and combining, again, the technologies that are already out there. So for example, ctDNAs, and in terms of the proteomics, how could those potentially help us, and using AI to then design a personalized theranostics. So I'm hoping that type of opportunity, I believe, will be there, but we do need teams of talented researchers to focus on that. And I think the other message, certainly from the federal government perspective, is that Canada, this area of theranostics is an area of interest to the feds, and there are a lot of activities. We've heard about champions, and I like to think of myself as one of the internal champions. I do talk to a number of people in terms of the importance of this area, and Canada and the federal government does recognize that we have a lot of talent within the country, and of course CIHR, funds a lot of we have a $1.2 billion a year budget, and we fund a lot of the investigator-initiated clinical trials. And actually, one other thing I should mention, so that there is an ongoing initiative in terms of funding from the Cancer Research Society, the Canadian Cancer Society, and the Terry Fox Research Institute in terms of investigator-initiated clinical trials. And so I would encourage everyone, I think the pre-announcement has just been made, and so I would encourage everyone to look at that as an opportunity for innovative clinical trials to complement the industry-sponsored clinical trials.
Perfect, thank you. It's nice to hear that there's focus and attention and it's moving forward, so that's great.
Yeah.
Dr. Jerzak, keeping on the AI theme, how is AI changing clinical trial design for radiotheranostics, particularly in patient selection, dosimetry, and prediction?
Yeah, thanks. And I think that's a great question. And there's, I think, a lot of potential for AI to help advance trials in general, but also trials related to radiotheranostics. I mean, I think ultimately a good trial should be one that treats the right patient with the right treatment at the right point in time, right? And I think AI could potentially help with all of those aspects. Thinking about treating the right patient to start, right? This is the beautiful thing about theragnostics. You sort of see what you treat what you see, but it can be more complicated than that. So often, we would do a pre-screening PET to look to see whether the protein of interest is expressed on the cancer, and it's important, but in reality, it's not so simple as, positive versus negative. So sometimes there are proteins in the cancer that may not necessarily be active in the cancer. They may not be the ones driving the cancer to progression, so treating those may not be the right answer. But above and beyond that, oftentimes cancer is heterogeneous. So you might do a scan looking for a biomarker, and there may be, for example, the liver metastases are positive, but the lung metastases are negative, right? So how do you handle that? And in the clinic, I can tell you as an example of two trials that we ran at Sunnybrook and we still have open. And one of them, Tracy 1 study, which is targeting the serotonin receptor, the trial required that 80% of the lesions of cancer have to be positive for the protein. But in another trial called OmniRay, targeting a different gastrin-releasing peptide. It's left more to the investigator discretion. So how do you know, what is the right answer? How do you know ahead of time what proportion of those cells have to be positive and how strongly positive do they have to be? So that's a challenge. But I think in the future, I really like what you said, Dr. Liu. I think maybe the answer is not just in the images. Maybe we need to look a little bit more broadly. So circulating tumor DNA, like you mentioned, we can now detect circulating tumor cells and actually have a look at the protein expressed on those circulating tumor cells. Maybe looking at standard clinical pathology features are important. So in the future, I see in an ideal world, AI pulling all of those data sources together to help better predict which patient is going to benefit the most from a therapy. And then I think, in terms of where else can AI be helpful, I just spoke about sort of baseline factors before treating a patient, but there's also this concept that you may have heard about earlier about adaptive therapies. So in the breast oncology space, recently came back from a meeting in Europe called ESMO Breast, and there was some really interesting data for HER2-positive breast cancer where, there's biomarkers that can be done like a PET image just after very short exposure to treatment can predict whether or not that patient's going to respond longer term. So I can see that AI may be used in that way as well in the future to help detect early responses before, we have to wait for a scan to show progression or response. So those are some of my initial thoughts.
Perfect. Let's we'll come back to Darryl and Chantal. Looking at radioisotope availability, you had talked about automation improving things like reliability and scalability and reproducibility. Maybe you can talk more about the role that it does play in those areas and the benefits it's bringing to the space.
Yeah, happy to. So, I think automation in general is an enabling technology that maybe isn't always fully understood. It's seen in almost this binary sense. Either it's manual or it's automated. And I think much like AI, the prevailing sentiment is that AI is not going to replace things. It's a tool that augments human performance and so on. That automation is the same thing. And so when that maturity of understanding is embraced within the radiopharma community, what we found is that the client is then generally more effective at putting a strategy together, understanding the nuances strategically of how that automation can be brought in to help enable radiopharma scale at the various phases and where it doesn't fit in. It doesn't work for clinical trials or phase 1 because it doesn't make sense from that point of view. But there's an evolution and a scaling of the automation solution that can also handshake with the production scale strategy. And so I think that the point is don't be afraid of automation, but also don't rely on it blindly because it can actually make things worse in some cases. And so that nuanced appreciation of the augmented nature of automation, robotics, repeated production, and so on. So yes, it can mitigate radiological exposure. Yes, it can allow you to do things in cell with more of a seamless process approach. So you're not constantly intervening inside the hot cell and so on. Higher QA, automated QA collection and data pedigree and so on. But there are times where you just need the human in the loop. Much like AI, you need that with automation as well. And there's things you can use like cobots, which are augmented robots. You can actually use a robotic arm doing something in a repeated process, but can literally just go and grab it, touch it, stop it, hit start again if you'd like. We've done a couple of applications with flask pick and place transfers with an operator right there with them. So I think that is one of the key factors that really enables the success or failure of automation, and that's where we try to come in, is to educate the client or customer in a knowledge evolution journey with us. So we're almost like an advisory role, not in an agnostic sense, but specific to the application that is not dissimilar to what Sage provides as well.
Just so to build on that a little bit. Machines are always going to be good at performing a very specific unit operation, and they're probably going to be able to do that quicker than a human can. So when you have a mature process that you can break down into those specific unit operations, it makes sense, especially depending on volumes, to automate those operations. Like Darryl mentioned, The industry right now is in that growing phase, so it might not make sense today, or the process might not be mature enough to break it down to that level where you're going to benefit from the increased cycle time of using automation over manual operations. But as you start to emerge into that level, it is going to be quicker and easier to increase the cycle rate of an automated process than to throw more people at it. So it is really that balance, but definitely automation has a huge upside, but the trick is finding the right time to implement those solutions.
And I think just picking up on that one is, as you design your process, if you design your process strictly for radiopharma production scale in discord to automation considerations, then you need to kind of merge them at some point, and it can be kind of like a jerky kind of motion, like trying to figure out how to drive standard, right? So if you're intentional about the automation solutions you may want to think about as you design your process in the radiopharma scale lifecycle, with consideration automation, it makes it a much more intentional and seamless scale as well. Because we've seen numerous times, certain applications, we bought a hot cell. Fantastic. Now we want to do all these things inside of it. Well, there's no room because you didn't think about the automation inside of it, and now it's just too full. So now you need to buy another hot cell or scrap that one and buy a bigger one. Whereas if it's, we want to get to this point, so right now we're going to buy this size hot cell that can do, XYZ manually or whatever it is, but at some point we're going to want to adapt this for the next phase that has the capacity and capability to integrate that automation within the CapEx that we've already committed to.
If there's one consistent aspect of this field, it's evolving very rapidly. Rapidly in the volume perspective, whether it's manufacturing or patients or the analytics that are involved, and the complexity. From an automation perspective, when do groups need to start thinking about this, and what sort of steps or processes are going to be the most impactful in the short term as you think about what the scalability and needs are going to be in that 5-10 year horizon or longer from a manufacturing facility?
That's a very tough question, and it's going to be very dependent on a lot of factors, and there is no one-size-fits-all answer. It's not that once you hit this level of throughput, you should automate. If it were, you wouldn't need people like Darryl and myself to help you find those solutions and determine that right point to start working this into your daily processes. So it is going to depend on a lot of things like your facility size, like your capital available, like your willingness to bet on volumes increasing. In most cases, it ends up being more of a financial decision than a process decision. The question really is, when is it worth it to the manufacturer to invest in that automation because they see the returns?
Yes, it's a complex question. And what we've seen recently, I say recently, the past maybe 5 years, it's almost like like rush hour traffic where all of a sudden things open up and they stop, and they open up and they stop. And so like one of the big issues at the time was supply of the irradiated material. Well, then Bruce Power and OPG and CANDU figured out how to do large batch irradiation of raw material inside the reactors, beyond just research. And now there's this dearth of irradiated supply. Well, then the downstream next impact is the processing side. Well, then processing scales up. Well, now there's the downstream from there, and then you need to get to the clinician side and get distribution. So there's a bunch of kind of kinks in the chain that if they were all to be lined up, in an optimized manner, maybe AI can help with that. You could then apply automation in a very planned way because you know where it's going to hit. But the fact is, there are a lot of random degrees of freedom in the various phases of the life cycle of radiopharm from radiation to patient. And so as that gets kind of smoothed out, you'll see more of a cadence to it. But I think until then, it is a bit of a stop-start, because the fact is these programs can take years, right? Or 18 months or whatever it is. So there is a bit of a estimate that you need to lob the football at the the 10-yard line to get a touchdown Hail Mary, but if you don't throw the ball at all, you never get there. But whether you plan it or not, you're not going to know when there. So there's a degree of risk in the CapEx investment, and that's why you need the capital behind it. You need to be able to deploy the capital and get it lined up and commit to it. But the fact is, we've seen programs in the past where we've quoted jobs for big programs, but then 3 months later they cancel it because on the client side, on the customer side, they'd predicted a volume of consumption that justified that automation, but then they revised their forecast down by 50% or 25%. Well, now we don't need automation right now because we can still get with our manual process. And so, it's predictable to a certain extent, but you kind of like, you make a plan, but then you adapt to reality. So that's, the challenge, I think.
Looking at imaging, Dr. Jerzak, and I'll probably chime in here as well, what breakthroughs in advanced imaging techniques are most needed to better link diagnostics with therapeutic decision making?
Right, I think we touched on that a little bit before in terms of, what extent of expression of a biomarker on the PET scan is really required. And actually, remind me, we had over lunch, we spoke a little bit about this. And I can give you an example from antibody drug conjugates in solid tumors. So antibody drug conjugate essentially is a pharmaceutical agent which has an antibody, a chemical linker, and then a chemotherapy attached to it. So the idea is in some ways a little similar. You're delivering active therapy to biomarker positive cells, but this time it's chemo instead of radiation. And there's a drug called TDXD that has been remarkably effective at treating 20% of patients with breast cancer that have HER2 positive disease. But it's been interesting to watch the evolution over the last couple of years, because initially we were using it only in HER2 positive, but now we know it also works in HER2 low. So we've moved from 20% of the population to like 75% of the population. And the next step, we now know that this drug only needs even HER2 ultra low status. So that's trace amount of the protein visible on pathology, where sometimes, I don't know if there's any pathologists in the room here, but it's challenging even to detect that. And the drug still works, so I think making parallels to theragnostics, I think that's one of the areas that needs a little bit more work. And, how do you best predict, again, what level of expression you need? That's an unanswered question. And it might depend on the scenario. So you had mentioned, different scenarios depending from the manufacturing point of view. It's the same in clinical trials. So thinking about the patient you're treating, the subtype you're treating, the agent that you're using, all those things may be important in making that decision.
Excellent. And I'll just add, looking at what we're seeing as this field continues to progress, and I have visibility to what's going on in Canada, but also in the U.S., where it's accelerating differently and more rapidly in certain areas. As we're seeing more integration between multidisciplinary programs, the need for dosimetry, the potential for multi-target biological insight, the role of better and more quantitative imaging is going to play a factor in all of this as well too. So in the short term, having the capability of doing routine dosimetry as a general technique for all patients is something that's going to be, I think, very important as we move forward, especially. The technology needs to support it as well. The other piece is quantitative standardization, and I think that was mentioned yesterday. PET-CT, SPECT-CT imaging, quantitative, but work can be done to refine it and provide more consistency and of course standardization across multi-centers, multi-tiers and technologies, multi-vendors. There's lots of different variability. That's more midterm. There's work being done globally in a number of organizations to do that. That's going to make a big difference in the data efficacy and consistency, both in the clinical space and the clinical trial space. And then going back to the commentary about adding more information to that diagnostic decision making. So not just looking at the images as a standalone decision or diagnostic, but bringing in all of the information that's available from that patient's full history and incorporating that into predictive algorithms, decision making algorithms, and really looking at, as we really want to push this field forward, building we'll call it a fully integrated diagnostic loop, where you have the imaging to identify the target expression. You have models built to incorporate the data to make that predictive, analytical, more robust and comprehensive analysis of what therapy do I start with. Today we've got monotherapies. Combination therapies are being well examined and will continue to expand. The decision making is going to be far more complex and many options for patients is always a good thing, but deciding on the right one, as you just articulated, is key. So having that closed loop where the imaging, the data can be brought into it, the right and the most appropriate starting point can be determined, administer the therapy, follow up with the imaging, use that data to then determine what's the next step. Do we refine? Do we pivot? How do we adapt? And that's really where we need to get to. Lots of work to do. There's also, you can't do all of that without the infrastructure to support it. So it's not just the techniques, it's having the availability of the infrastructure, and that's a big piece, and we've talked about that at length as well. When we look at the potential for emerging technologies supporting the production in clinical settings, what are the key barriers to adoption? You talked about, and Chantal and maybe everyone can chime in, you talked about cost. What about validation and regulation? And then I think applicable to all areas, workforce readiness.
Yeah, so I think we have touched on cost a little bit already, and just building on that previous discussion, because this is one of the largest barriers to implementation, certainly right now. Part of the problem that Darryl mentioned is this is a growing industry, so the data on commercial forecasts is really just highly variable. And when you see a reduction by, for example, 50% in that forecast, it's going to have an impact on a business's ability to invest in that technology. So it is just difficult to quantify your return on investment for a lot of these technological solutions that can be, let's face it, very expensive, because this is a highly specialized industry. It's not easy to make these things, and it's certainly not cheap to make them. The next hurdle is validation, because we are working in a highly regulated space. So you do need to be able, with any system that you're implementing, you have to be able to prove conclusively that it does perform the operation that you expect it to perform, and that it does so accurately and reliably. In order to be able to do that, it takes time, it takes expertise, and it takes investment. So again, this is added cost to implementing your technology. On top of that, we have the added challenge with now incorporating artificial intelligence. I mentioned before, there is starting to be some guidance around how to validate those tools, because they don't fit the typical mold of technology that we would historically validate, right? The point of artificial intelligence is that it learns and it adapts. So this is not an easy thing to test and prove that it's producing reliable results. There is guidance from the FDA, from ISPE, and from a couple other agencies out there that highly depend on a few key aspects. One being a very well-defined context of use. You have to know exactly what you're using the data that your model produces for. You have to have a well-built out and robust risk assessment for that application of that model. You have to basically justify your methodology of training that model. So what are your inputs to the model that give you that confidence in the outputs that it will produce? And then there is always this aspect, again, that Darryl touched on earlier, of human in the loop, which means that there is ongoing oversight from a human to make sure that your model is continuing to produce results that you expect and that appear to be accurate.
I mean, I think even above and before we even get to AI, there's some simple things too, hurdles. Like when we at Sunnybrook started opening the breast radioligand trials, it's just really important to have a good functioning team, right? So to treat a patient on trial, I'm looking at Amit, who's here at Sunnybrook with me, but you need the medical oncologist, you need the radiation oncologist, you need the nuclear medicine, physicians and staff. And I have to say, before we opened those trials, I wasn't familiar with the nuclear medicine team, and so now we're working together, and you really do need all the expertise from those team members within, in one place. So that's the first step, and then building upon that, there's additional higher functioning tools, I guess, that can also be helpful in the future.
Yeah, I mean, just to jump into that one as well, with the validation side, again, it's what's the problem we're trying to solve and defining that early on at the outset and what are the obstacles we need to hurdle. We've seen, with some customers who understand we need to validate this at some point. And so they're taking that into consideration at the upstream phase as an input and deliverable that we need to consider through the design process. Others are like, okay, we need a system that does X, Y, and Z. And let's get equipment and CapEx and a process that does that. Oh, and by the way, now we need to validate it. And now you need to kind of go back upstream through the whole process and try to change the logic and the software architecture and so on, because now you need to seamlessly loop in. It's almost like trying to put like a nervous system into a skeleton in a body you've already built without putting the nervous system in, like analogously, right? And so I think that really being intentional about what is it we need to do and what do we need to achieve, and making sure those are identified. And part of that's with an integrated team, like breaking down silos. Who are the stakeholders who need to approve and who actually needs to use the system? From the QA point of view, because again, we've seen a number of times where engineers design things because it's a cool design, but the user's like, this doesn't work for me. So at the end of the day, who's the stakeholder, right? And if it's a validation, if it's QA, if it's FDA approval, like understand the FDA requirements and don't build a system that can't be validated.
The next question is an important one. Dr. Liu, how do we ensure that the innovation in technology actually translates into faster patient access rather than adding just new layers of complexity in the process?
Right, so thank you so much, Craig, for that very complex question. As I already mentioned, the barriers in terms of translating the innovations to patient access is a recognized challenge that the government is trying to address. And so certainly from a clinical trials perspective, and some of you are aware of this, so CIHR has funded a CAN review, which is a single pan-Canadian national REB approval process, so that any multi-center clinical trials will not have to undergo 9 different REB approval processes, but instead there will only be a single one. And CAN review is now in the process of obtaining agreements to be signed across all of the institutions which participate and contribute patients to clinical trials. And so anticipating and hoping that this will be completed within the coming year or so, going forward, certainly CIHR and many other funders will be releasing the funds if and only if your clinical trial has been approved through the single CAN review process. And as another strategy, Health Canada, likewise, in terms of sponsored, funded clinical trials, would also be strongly encouraged to go through this single CAN review process. And so that's one strategy that the government is specifically funding to be promoting the execution and the speeding up basically, patients' access to innovative drugs and treatments. From a grants and contracts perspective, likewise, it's also going to be issuing a template so that industry and academic institutions will have some type of a template, again, to try to expedite and facilitate. I have to confess I was a little bit disappointed that Health Canada sounds like it's still a bit of a barrier, because we do know that Health Canada has been instructed to be more facilitatory rather than being obstructionist, and I know that there are a lot of activities in that particular area. So for example, if a particular drug or compound has been already approved in other jurisdictions like the EU or the US, then they're not going to be duplicating any reviews. That's certainly one strategy. And so I do have contact at Health Canada, so be happy to try to understand this a little bit better in terms of why the medical isotopes sounds like it's still a bit of a barrier, although we do know that it's beyond just Health Canada. There's also CNSC that's involved in terms of the quality assessment and safety. I think another thing that we want to mentioned a little bit about in terms of the teams, right? And also, Darryl, your point about, what are we trying to solve the problem for? And I think, again, looking at this from a patient's perspective, I think is what's very, very anchoring and grounding. And so in the end, this type of treatment, whatever you're proposing, whatever you're innovating, has to be able to be accessible by the patient. And so having a health economist on your team at the very get-go would be very helpful in terms of demonstrating at the end, in addition to the safety, which is the Health Canada, but also the funding, which happens at the P&T level, the provincial territorial level. And so having a health economist on the team at the get-go to be able to kind of say, okay, this is an investment that is worthwhile in terms of the cost saving, the life saves, the quality adjusted life years saved to the patient as part of the discussion. And that should probably be done fairly early on once you're in close to that stage.
Thank you very much. We've reached the end of our session, a quick 40 minutes from our perspective. Great conversation, great topics, very important in the future of this field. I'll just close with I think, a commentary that we can all agree on, that the single most important enabler in all of this is collaboration. Bringing together the science, the technology, the clinical need, the scalability, and as you just said, the economics is an absolute important piece. And one stakeholder can't do this alone. So working closely together, all of us together, will push this field forward. So thank you very much for your participation, and thank you everyone for your time. Cheers.